Hello, my friends. It's good to see you. Now that we're back to our virtual format, I have a chance to make some kids videos. And this morning I wanted to make a video where I share a story called God Said Amen. And it's a story by Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. And it's been in my library for quite some time. I think it's been at the chapel longer than me. Looks like it was a gift from someone. And it is a lovely story. So I hope you enjoy it. Long ago, there was a place called the Kingdom of Midnight, where the land was lush because water was plenty, but there was no oil to light the lamps. When the sun set, darkness swept through the kingdom. The Kingdom of Midnight was ruled by a grand prince, and he hated the dark. He stumbled around the large palace rooms, bumping into the royal throne until he was royally black and blue. He could not find his royal pajamas. I cannot be a proper prince without my royal pajamas, he yelled. No one dared to say no to the grand prince, especially one who yelled, and no one dared to be his friend. When the shadows fell like sleepy eyelids on every home, people held on to each other, but no one hugged the prince. Night after night, alone in his palace, he prayed to God for an answer to his problem. One morning, a roving minstrel told the grand prince of a place where oil flowed freely and light brightened the darkest night. At the edge of your land, just beyond the trees, lies the kingdom of the desert, described the minstrel. It is ruled by a grand princess. Perhaps this was the answer to his prayers. He mounted his royal crane and rode to the place where a valley divided his kingdom from the kingdom of the desert. There, from a distance, he saw light and the princess. The kingdom of the desert was a land that sparkled with light, but there was no water to grow gardens. The grand princess bemoaned the lack of water. Her white royal robes were always dull from dirt and dust. Without water, there was no hot royal tea. I cannot be a proper princess without royal tea, she shouted. No one dared to say no to a grand princess, especially one who shouted. And no one dared to be her friend. When storms blew sand throughout the kingdom, the people held on to each other, but no one hugged the princess. Night after night, she prayed to God for an answer to her problem. One morning, a roving minstrel told the grand princess of a place where the water flowed freely and gardens grew in abundance. Go to the edge of your land, and there, just beyond the sand dunes, is the Kingdom of Midnight, promised the minstrel. It is ruled by a grand prince. Perhaps this was the answer to her prayers. She rode her royal ostrich to a place where a valley divided her kingdom from the Kingdom of Midnight. There, from a distance, she saw water and the prince. When the grand prince returned to his kingdom, he ordered the keeper of the royal crane, inform the princess that if she desires water, she must come to me with jugs of oil. But when the grand princess heard the prince's demands, she refused. When the grand princess returned to her kingdom, she ordered the keeper of the royal ostrich, inform the prince that if he desires oil, he must come to me, bearing buckets of water. But when the grand prince heard the princess's demands, he refused. God was sad that the grand prince and princess did not see the answer to their prayers. Many nights passed, but despite the darkness in the desert, the prince and the princess would not budge. Then one morning, the boy who was the keeper of the royal crane led it to the prince's window. The girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich led it to the palace door of the princess. The prince and the princess thought it strange that the children should bring the crane and ostrich from their royal stables without being told to do so. The royal crane whooped, "Perhaps I should go speak to the princess," mused the grand prince. The royal ostrich screeched. Perhaps I should go speak to the prince, mused the grand princess. And so the prince and princess each rode to the place where the valley divided their kingdoms. This time the prince came close enough to hear the princess praying for water. Her voice sounds like desert winds, he said wistfully. For a moment, he thought he might go to meet her, but then he yelled, I am the grand prince. She must come to me. His heart grew cold and hard. The princess heard the prince offer a prayer for light. His voice sounds like summer rain, she said sadly. For a moment, she thought she might go to meet him, but then she shouted, I am the grand princess. He must come to me. Her heart grew cold and hard. The day wore on, but in his stubbornness, the prince would not move. When darkness swept through his kingdom, the legs of the prince became as hard as rock and as cold as stone. The day wore on, but in her stubbornness, the princess would not move. When a storm blew sand through her kingdom, the legs of the princess became as cold as stone and as hard as rock. God was sad that the grand prince and grand princess had refused to see the answer to their prayers. The people of the Midnight Kingdom and the Desert Kingdom awaited their prince and princess. When they saw the royal crane and the royal ostrich return without their riders, they knew something was wrong. But the people were afraid to venture out to the edges of their kingdoms, to a place they had never been. But the young boy who was the keeper of the royal crane decided to follow it wherever it would lead him. The young girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich decided to follow it wherever it would lead her. At the very place where the valley divided the kingdoms, the royal crane whooped and the royal ostrich screeched. They would go no further. The young boy and girl stopped and saw each other. They seemed to hear voices like summer rain and desert wind, but when they looked down, they only found 2 pairs of royal shoes lying on the ground. They looked up and saw 2 mountains with peaks shaped like royal crowns. The mountains looked very familiar. When the boy of the Midnight Kingdom saw how the girl's lips were cracked and how her skin was dry as twigs, he gave her the jug of water he had taken for his journey. When the girl heard of the terrible darkness that made the boy tremble at night, she gave him the jug of oil she had carried for her journey. The boy and girl returned to their kingdoms to tell the people what they had found. At first, the people of the kingdoms did not believe the children. They are just imagining, they all agreed. Princes and princesses do not turn into mountains. But when the people saw the boy's jug of oil and the girl's jug of water, even though they didn't believe the story, they followed the children anyway. When the people finally arrived at the edges of their kingdom, they saw the mountains with peaks like royal crowns. There was no doubt that these were the Grand Prince and the Grand Princess. The boy who was the keeper of the royal crane and the girl who was the keeper of the royal ostrich brought each other jugs of oil and jugs of water. Before long, all the people were doing the same. There was enough water and enough oil for everyone. The people called the place where they gathered between the 2 mountains the Valley of Seeing, because at long last they saw God's answer to their prayers. Each year, the people of the 2 kingdoms bring their children to the Valley of Seeing to tell the story of the mountains. Voices like summer rain and desert wind still whisper prayers in the valley. And God smiles and says, Amen. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little story. It is truly often children who are called to lead us back to what is really true. So even though it may seem And it is true that your parents and grown-ups, they have a lot more knowledge. They've lived a lot longer. They have more experiences. But that doesn't mean that you don't also sometimes have something to teach them. And sometimes it's just the simplest thing of seeing, just like that valley of seeing the people in front of you and what they need, and seeing what you have to offer. Have a great week, friends, and I'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.